Chapter 1. My Early Childhood, 1991 to Spring Term 2004. Before 5th grade, 1991 to Spring Term 2002. I was born on July 3, 1991 on the south side of downtown Stockholm, the capital of Sweden, called Södermalm. A few months later, I and my parents moved up north to Umeå since that's where all my relatives lived. Umeå is the largest city in northern Sweden and the 13th largest in Sweden, with a population of about 90,000. Both of my parents grew up in two different small towns in Västerbotten, the quote county where Umeå's located. A Swedish county is actually equivalent of a US state. We moved into a suburban neighborhood called Grubbe, on the west side of Umeå. That's where I got to grow up. Already at about age 4 or 5, I started watching MTV and ZTV, a Swedish music channel, regularly. I watched those channels about as much as I watched cartoons. Thanks to those channels, I was introduced to music and TV shows meant for teens and young adults real early in life. I remember also watching Beavis and Butthead on MTV often. Before continuing, I should tell you about Asperger syndrome. It's a mental disability that you're born with. Typical symptoms of it is being numb, antisocial, etc., but it doesn't affect your IQ level. People with ASP are somewhat more likely than people without it to have kids with ASP. As I know it, I don't got any ASP in my family though. I do however have a couple of alcoholic relatives not so far back in my family tree, and possibly one or two indigenous Swedes, Samis, further back, which might explain my other, unofficial diagnoses that would show up later in life. People with ASP usually have a special interest, which they're really good at while they're often really bad at everything else. One of my special interests in my early childhood was cars. I was real good at pointing out car brands at a distance. Another interest was music. I've also had a real good tone hearing since early childhood. I noticed easily if someone sang a bad tone, even though I've never been a good singer myself. I also noticed if a guitar was badly tuned, even though I never learned to play or tune the guitar until junior high. At age 3, I was diagnosed with autism and mild retardation, actually a wrongful diagnosis. As a result, I was placed in a special education class in elementary. In late August 1998, I started first grade at Bergum Skolan located on the other side of town. Had I been diagnosed with ASP, or not diagnosed at all for that matter, I would have gone to a normal class at Grisbacka Skolan where I lived. The special ed class that I went to had about 5 to 7 kids, all of which had full-blown autism. Autism is similar to ASP, but it's somewhat stronger, including lower IQ. When I started 3rd grade in late August 2000, I started going to an after-school program at Kolbäcksskolan located in Oldham. The place was called Moonman in Swedish and the kids there were even worse disabled than my classmates at Bergum. These kids were all about my age, but they couldn't talk, wore diapers, drooled, licked windows, etc. Every kid, including me, had his or her own assistant. During my time at Moonman, I had up to about 5-10 different assistants, one at a time of course. At Bergum, we only had one teacher and one assistant for 6 to 8 students. Since I was much less disabled than the other kids at Moonman, I didn't really like being there. I wanted to go home right after Bergum but couldn't because my parents were at work. But I did like it at Bergum though. My classmates weren't much different from me actually, despite me having ASP, according to a later diagnosis, and them having autism. They could talk and use the toilet just like me. They didn't drool or lick windows. I got along with them just fine, unlike at Moonman. I couldn't communicate with the kids there so I got to become friends with the assistants instead. At both schools, and at home, I interacted quite often with normal kids, meaning kids that weren't disabled. As I remember it, it went quite well actually. It didn't bother much that I had ASP. But I would have never managed to go to a normal class and have class with them. I believe it was thanks to my false diagnosis, and thus the special ed class in Moonman, that interacting with normal class went so good. Otherwise I would have been all by myself in a normal classroom, and thus probably the same out on the yard, very likely bullied also. I remember one time at Kolbäck, when a kid was moving out of town far away. I think it was in 4th grade. I was told to sign my name on a card, where everyone else had signed their names. I refused, since I wasn't good friends with a kid my age that couldn't talk and wore diapers. His assistant refused to accept my decision and kept nagging me. I wasn't allowed to leave the spot until I signed my name, so I sat there for at least an hour. 1 hour for a 10-year-old is like an entire day for an adult, so I had to be real patient, good preparation for a police interrogation, haha. Finally, she decided to sign my name on the card, without my permission. I got real mad since that was supposed to be my decision, not hers. This was one of a number of more rebellious moments during my first 11 years in life, and a quite good sign of what I was gonna accomplish, and cause, in the future. Speaking of that, I started running away from school quite often in 4th grade, without anything specific having happened. Usually I only ran to a nearby playground or grove. But one sunny day, in the spring term I think, I ran all the way from Berghem Schoolin to Kolbach Schoolin, through the entire university campus located between both schools. That was my longest escape at that age, about 1.9 miles, 3 kilometers that is. I clearly remember hearing the song, Forgot About Dre, from a silver-colored convertible that passed by on my right side. One time around the same year or some year before, I ran from my father's house to my mother's, who were currently separated but lived very close to each other, about 750 meters/0.45 miles apart. And that wasn't the only time I ran away from home. At about age 5, I walked many blocks away from home one sunny day, and my father found me perhaps 30 to 60 minutes later. One day during the spring term of 2002, my teacher at Berghem, who I'd had since 1st grade, told me and my classmates she was gonna quit working at Berghem and switch to another school the coming fall. I can't remember if she chose to switch or if she had to. Either way, we were devastated. I took it the hardest. She'd been a real good teacher through the years. My life was gonna change quite a bit the coming years, for better and worse, but it was nonetheless necessary. 5th and 6th grade, fall term 2002 to spring term 2004. Starting 5th grade, I and my classmates got a new teacher. I also had a personal assistant there, a guy around age 18 to 22 who was heavily into hip-hop. Until then, I'd listened to pretty much any music genre without any preference. But when this guy came into my life, I got introduced into a lot of new hip-hop that I'd never heard before. He also introduced me to a chat site at Aftonbladet, a Swedish newspaper, with an age limit of 15, and rightfully so. I used it regularly until I myself was about 14-15. There, I got to learn a lot of new profanity, mainly sex-related, which I didn't learn to understand until junior high, and that I shouldn't have learned until then. I also got to rent 8 Mile the same fall, right after it stopped showing at movie theaters. The movie was rated age 11, the equivalent of PG-13. That's why I got to watch it so early in life. Had it been rated 15, rated R that is, I would have had to wait until I turned 13. That movie, as well as my new assistant, stirred up my interest in hip-hop heavily. Now I started leaning more towards hip-hop, as well as other black genres and also rock genres. This fall I gradually started using the computer and the internet more, and watching TV less. I started to grow past cartoons. I no longer had access to ZTV. MTV had started showing less music videos and more reality shows compared to the 90s. On top of that, I was real curious about the internet and all it had to offer. Consequently, I started using the computer more frequently the coming years, unlike previously when I'd been more outdoors. Unlike the TV, which only had about 10 channels, there were millions of websites on the internet. On top of that, I could do pretty much anything I wanted on each website, while on the TV I could only watch a channel. I couldn't interact with it other than playing with the volume and video settings, which I did quite often back in kindergarten. I'd been playing computer and video games since age 6 to 7, but the internet was more interactive than even that. But I could only use the internet for 1 hour a day, since we only had modem, which meant that the internet went real slow. My parents also had to pay for every single minute I spent on it. When the fall term began, we got a new teacher, again. I was okay with the first one, but this one, I did not like. That was partly because she didn't have a car, which meant that we had to take walks more often, sometimes real long ones. One time, I and my class had to walk all the way from Berghem to downtown, about the same distance as Kolbach. I've had just as long walks and longer, a good number of times later in life without a problem, and I ran to Kolbach without a problem, but since I was only 11 and a bit spoiled, this felt like walking all the way from Staten Island to the eastern end of Long Island in New York City. Imagine that. I also felt that this teacher behaved somewhat more childishly compared to the first two teachers, plus was very non-apprehensive. I didn't find the security in her like in our first teacher. That made me start running away from school almost every day now. I usually ran to a playground right south of the school. One time in 5th grade, I ran all the way to the university campus located right next to Bergam, still nothing compared to Colback of course. One time, I got to visit my assistant's apartment. Eventually, I had to quit school and be at home all the time. But I still had to be at Moonman as usual. I remember having to be there even during the holidays, which I did not like. I remember frequently screaming at home that I wanted to die. I don't believe that I actually wanted to, because if so, I would have remembered that. I just wanted back my old teacher. I remember visiting BUP one time, a psychiatry unit for children, where I was given some prescription drug. I got to take one pill a day, and then I stopped screaming I wanted to die. I no longer felt devastated, but then I started suffering from a lack of appetite. Consequently, I stopped using the drug after about a month or so. Now it also started to show that I was less disabled than my classmates at Bergam. Since quite a lot had happened since our teacher left, I'd matured a bit unlike them. They didn't seem to change like I did. They didn't dislike our new teacher like I did. It must have been because I had ASP, which I would turn out to have soon, and they had autism that I developed somewhat better than them, especially after our teacher left. As a result, I was diagnosed with ASP during the spring/summer of 2003. I remember my mother telling me about my disability around that time for the first time. I also got a shrink that I visited like 3 or 4 times each term all the way until the summer of 2010. Due to my new diagnosis, things became very different in 6th grade. I was totally detached from my old class. I got to have a one-man class where I was the only student. I was placed in a small building with a little classroom fitting only about 3 people. Then I had my own room in the same building, with a radio and some comic books. I also had my own 2 teachers, one male and one female, who worked alone 2 and 3 days separately. On the side, the male teacher worked at Ersingsskolan, a junior high school located in Ersbuda in northeastern Umeå. He took me quite often to the library located at the Ersbuda Community Center where there were lots of CDs. I remember borrowing Dr. Dre's 2001, Eminem's The Eminem Show, Jay-Z's Jay-Z Unplugged, and Nelly's Nellyville. I also got to visit Ersingsskolan once, probably during the spring of 2004. I also got to visit his house and my female teacher's house one time respectively. I was at Moonman only once in the fall of 2003. I remember not getting to use the computer alone because one of the other kids had done something on the computer, can't remember what. Like you already know, these kids were much worse disabled than me, so they definitely needed adult supervision. I'd been allowed to use the computer alone before, which I had done well, and I definitely didn't want supervision, much less now since I wanted to use the often blotted chat site. Devastated that I couldn't use the computer alone anymore, I never wanted to be at Moonman ever again. Fortunately, this became my very last time there. Finally I got to go home right after Bergam. During the winter of 2004, my father bought and installed the virus protection program Norton Internet Security. This program had a child security function, which made my father able to block certain sites such as those who contained viruses, porn etc. My father didn't pick any sites himself, he just crossed out some categories and then the program itself decided which sites to block. The big downside to this was that some sites, including the chat site, that didn't contain any viruses or porn were blocked unnecessarily. I hated it. The program made me feel a bit underestimated and limited, oppressed actually. Now I'm only glad I got blocked from that chat site. It had a very negative influence on me considering its actual content, considering all the profanity I learned. Given that I got to learn those words in junior high anyway, I really didn't need to learn them at age 11 already, and thus get so fascinated by them. It really wasn't the best way to grow up, to enter teenagehood, to become more mature and more normal than my classmates. A lot of the same actually goes for 8 Mile and the rap albums I borrowed from the library, although they had a much bigger and better function and purpose than the chat site, especially 8 Mile. The big plus about my new fascination with profanity was just that I became more mature and normal, that I became somewhat rebellious, that I became somewhat of an outcast, a black sheep. That would become very necessary and useful in junior high and the rest of my whole life actually. That's why it actually saved me. But the real reason was actually my newborn interest in hip-hop. That made it about so much more than just profanity, at least in the long run. But at first it was too much about just that. Another big minus about my newborn interest in the internet, although that itself was only positive, was that I spent a lot more time indoors now. Given the fact that I didn't get much out of the internet during my early years of usage, I would have been better off more outdoors like before. It was much later that I would really start putting the internet to good use, that I would really start using it for way better things than profanity and such. That would take me away much further than 2 miles, physically speaking.